It's my sincere pleasure as the Chief Executive Officer of the New England Aquarium to welcome you all here tonight to hear our honored guest, Josh Stewart. He's going to share his research and his conservation efforts with you and work that spans from the Pacific in Mexico to the Maldives and beyond. He has been really working in conservation science for over a decade and studies a range of topics from marine protected area design to endangered species conservation. And for the past 5 years, he's been focused on the science really behind how we can effectively protect manta rays. And he's a student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
All right, so tonight we're going to talk all about oceanic manta rays and mantas in general. I'll give you a brief overview of what we know about mantas, their biology, their ecology, the research that we're doing and the big knowledge gaps that we've encountered, and threats to mantas and what we're trying to do using our research to help improve the future outlook and the conservation of mantas. So let's get started. See if this clicker works for me. So usually when I tell people that I study manta rays, they're thinking about these guys, stingrays, and they often ask me, oh, that's really dangerous, right? You know, Steve Irwin got killed by one of those. And I have to tell them that, yes, well, mantas are related to these stingrays, which we see many places, but they're actually quite different. They've taken a completely different evolutionary path. So these stingrays and what we have up here, bat rays and cownose rays, these guys are all benthic feeders. So they're feeding on crustaceans and sometimes even squid eggs and things that are on the surface of the seafloor. Mantas, on the other hand, have taken a completely different strategy. They're pelagic, so they're up in the water column. They can actually never stop moving. They have to constantly move in order to breathe. So as I go through this talk, there are going to be lots of nice photos, and I didn't take all of them. So whenever possible, I've given you a watermark or a copyright down here. So just take note of that if you're wondering who took these beautiful photos. All right, so what are manta rays? They look quite a bit different from the stingrays, right? We've got this family of rays called the Mobulidae, and that includes the mobula rays, which are on the left here, and we've got 9 species of these guys, and then the manta rays on the right. And we've got at least 2 species, and we think 3 and maybe even more than that. So these guys, as I said, they live in open water. They're constantly swimming. They're up in the water column. And what makes them different from a lot of these other rays is that they're filter feeders. So they're feeding on tiny zooplankton, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So we've got a broad diversity of manta and mobula rays. They come in different sizes. They live in different habitats. We see really wild behaviors. So this guy down on the bottom left, this is Mobula monkeyiana, which Nigella was talking about joining us on an expedition to go study these guys. And they aggregated huge numbers and display this really amazing jumping behavior. We've got manta rays on the right, which are enormous, incredibly friendly, lots of diver interactions. Everybody loves them. And I would love to tell you everything I know about mobula rays and manta rays, but then we'd be here for 3 or 4 hours. So I'm going to just keep it to the manta rays on the right side here for this evening's talk. And you're welcome to ask questions about mobulas after the talk. So where do we find manta rays? Pretty much all over the world. So they're what we call circumglobal. They can be found in pretty much any ocean, and they tend to stay in this band of relatively warm water, so tropical, subtropical, sometimes into temperate water. You occasionally get manta rays as far north as New Jersey, as far south as New Zealand, but for the most part they stop around Mexico and Peru, and they spend a lot of time by the equator as well. So we've got the 2 different species distribution here, Manta birostris, which is the big oceanic manta, which most of the talk is going to be about today. And then those guys are all over the world, and the reef mantas are found in the Indo-Pacific and not really any further east than Hawaii and French Polynesia. All right, so let's get to the fun stuff. So what do we know about mantas? Mantas are really big. So the biggest manta that's ever been recorded is, well, the oceanic mantas are quite a bit bigger. And the biggest one ever recorded was 8 meters in disc width, which is wingspan, essentially. The ones that we see are normally around 4 or 5 meters, which is 15 feet, 16 feet. The biggest one I've ever seen, that was one of the questions at the ocean tank, was 6 meters, so 18, 19, maybe 20 feet. Really, really big animals, incredible animals. And they're one of the only animals of this size that I think you could really get this close to. So even if you're going on a safari to see elephants or something, you're stuck in your safari vehicle, you can't get out because they'll trample you. If you want to go dive with great white sharks, you have to stay in a cage. There's not really another big animal I can think of that you can really do this with and interact with. So they're great animals. They're big, they're also very smart. So along with that large size, they have a really big brain. But not every large animal has a large brain. So we can look at what's called the brain to body mass ratio to get an idea of how smart an animal could be. And elasmobranchs in general, they tend to have a bigger brain to body mass ratio. And mantas have the largest brain to body mass ratio of any fish. And it brings them up into the range of what mammals have. They also have very highly developed parts of their brain that we usually associate with problem solving, complex social interactions. And so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that mantas are really, really smart. So they're big, they're smart, they're also long-lived. The only way that we can tell how long a manta lives is by tracking that single manta using these spot patterns on its belly. So each manta has a unique spot pattern, which is sort of like its fingerprint. And we can track these animals through time. And by doing that, we know that mantas can live at least 40 years. So that's the biggest gap we've had between two sightings. And they probably live more like 50 or 60 years. So they're big, they're smart, they're long-lived, they don't sound much like fish, right? They sound kind of like a mammal. So every manta has this unique spot pattern, and we take advantage of these, as I said, to track how long they live, but also other things like how often they give birth, how often they mate, how often they become pregnant. So here on the left, we've got a manta that is a very, very pregnant female. So for those of you who, I've never had the privilege of being pregnant, but I hear that your back hurts a lot when you do, and I think that this manta's got it pretty bad as well. So we can track how often they give birth, how often they're pregnant. We can also look at these scars over on the right here, which are mating scars, and so with that we can tell whether or not an individual has mated. And using all this information, we also know that mantas give birth to only one pup per pregnancy, which are these little manta burritos. They reach sexual maturity after about 5 to 10 years, and they only give birth every 2 to 7 years. So really, really, really low reproductive rates. Again, nothing like your typical fish. So a single manta gives birth to as many offspring in its entire life as other very endangered species like great white sharks might have in a single litter. So that's one of the reasons that they're really susceptible to fisheries, because they just have such slow population growth rates. All right, so this is just a still photo. We've got this big female in the front here and a bunch of smaller males, and you can really see the size difference between males and females there as well. So this big female and a smaller male who's competing for the privilege, right? So what does it look like when you have a successful male? He comes up, and they don't have any arms or fingers or hands or anything like that, so there's no manta cuddling. Instead, the male bites down on the fin of the female, which is where those scars that we saw a minute ago come from. And they flip belly to belly, and they do their thing, and often a jealous male comes along and tries to butt in. There's so many parallels with humans, right? So these mating trains often get mistaken for feeding trains as well. And that's what we're seeing here, and fair enough, they're very similar looking. But this is a completely different behavior. So like I said before, mantas are feeding on some of the smallest organisms in the ocean, the zooplankton. And by eating huge densities of zooplankton, it allows them to grow really big. So this is often the case with whales as well. Some of the biggest animals in the ocean are feeding on some of the tiniest animals. And so what we see here in this feeding train is, well, zooplankton, they can't really escape predators too well, right? But they have a few behaviors. They can jump up and down in the water column really quickly. So if a manta's coming along, a zooplankton might swim up really, really quickly to try and get away from it. But unfortunately for that zooplankton, there's another manta swimming right behind and above it, who he's going to scoop him right up. So this is a pretty complex cooperative feeding behavior. And this is another indication that mantas are really smart, right? There aren't that many large fishes that are feeding so cooperatively like this with really complex behaviors. What we're seeing on the right here are these cephalic fins, so that's what gives the devil rays their name. When they're rolled up, they look like they've got horns, and when they're unrolled, they're these really beautiful structures which help them channel water into their mouth to feed more effectively. They've also got lots of electroreceptors, so sometimes people see mantas while they're diving, and the manta will come over and unroll one of the cephalic fins, and it almost looks like it's waving at you. So people say, oh, the manta's waving at me. But actually it's sensing you, it's checking you out, seeing what you might be, why you're so bubbly, why you look like you're leaking. We see other cool feeding behavior. So up here we've got a barrel rolling manta. That's also really famous behavior. And what they're doing here is once they swim through a really dense patch of plankton, rather than just continuing on and hoping they find another one, they'll actually keep rolling through it again and again and again. And what they're doing is maximizing their feeding efficiency. And we see that in a really extraordinary case here in the Maldives. So this is the first place I ever really got to study and interact with mantas quite a bit. And what we've got here is up to 250 reef mantas, which can get to be about 12 feet across, in an area that's probably about the size of this room, maybe a little bit bigger, feeding on huge, dense swarms of zooplankton that get caught in this bay when the tides and the monsoon are just right. And so what we're seeing here is 250 mantas swimming all together in a cyclone. And when you're sitting outside when you're diving or snorkeling, you can actually kind of feel a current that's bringing you in. So all these mantas swimming around, what we think they're doing is actually creating a little vortex and sucking all this zooplankton into their feeding area so that they can feed more efficiently. Another really, really cool and complex behavior. So here's a big shot for you. Pretty extraordinary thing to witness. All right, so mantas, they're really big and they feed on tiny little guys. So what might be a predator for a manta? Any guesses based on these images? Yeah, what do you think? Well, just sharks in general. Yeah, so tiger sharks and other large sharks. We often see mantas with these big cuts out of the back of their wings. So these are bite marks. And actually in areas that have more sharks, like Mozambique, we have more mantas with bites, unsurprisingly. So the main predators are sharks, but we also get orcas feeding on mantas. And most of the time when a shark takes a chunk out, the manta probably hurts, but they tend to survive. When orcas get involved, they're not so lucky. I don't think there are many mantas that come out alive after an orca encounter. But with a shark, they actually have these remarkable abilities to regrow these bite marks. So this manta on the bottom left has a pretty sizable chunk taken out of him. This is the same manta right above him, a little bit smaller, and you can hardly see that chunk anymore. It's almost completely regrown. We just see a little bit of scar tissue and discoloration. So really, really amazing capacity to heal and regenerate tissue. Now, when they have these big bites, what they often do to keep them clean, right? If you guys get a scrape, you keep it clean, keep it from getting infected. And mantas will come to cleaning stations to do the same thing, not only when they have a bite, but also to just have parasites picked off of their bodies, out of their gills. We've got a pretty neat video here. So this is a cleaning station in the Maldives. And I'm going to turn around again. So you've got two mantas here. They come and they hover over the reef. And you'll see these really dense swarms of cleaner fish that come in. And what they're doing is they're picking parasites off, any debris or detritus or anything like that accumulates. And you can even see these guys swimming into the gill slits of the manta for a deep clean. And we also think that these cleaning stations are important areas for socializing. So mantas will come in again and again and again, and it's hard to imagine that they really have such high parasite loads that they need to come every single day. And we're pretty sure that they're also using this as an opportunity to socialize. So here you see one opening his mouth and letting the guys get right in there, the dentists at work. And again, this could play forever and you'd all be happy, but we'd be here until 10. All right, so these cleaning stations are really important from a tourism standpoint because they're pretty predictable. So mantas come into these areas again and again and again, and it provides a really nice opportunity for divers to interact. And this is a great example. This is our friend Mary, who's diving with some reef mantas in Raja Ampat. And this is one of the most important things that I can stress today is that mantas are hugely valuable in tourism. So around the world, every year, mantas bring in about $140 million, and a lot of that money is going to coastal communities in developing countries where the majority of people are surviving off of fisheries which are often unsustainable, and this manta tourism is a really important alternative. Of course, with every fish in the ocean, just about, it seems like, in addition to tourism and really nice positive things, we have fisheries. And fisheries for mantas are the biggest threat to these animals around the world. And so we've got targeted fisheries like we're seeing here. This is in Indonesia. You might be wondering, why are they catching these great animals? And the answer is they're actually just being targeted, not for their meat, they don't really have high quality fillets or anything like that, but for their gill rakers or gill plates. And that's the mechanism that allows them to strain the zooplankton out of the water as they open up their mouths and swim through a dense school of zooplankton. And these guys get dried and shipped to China, where they're used as a traditional Asian medicine. So we've got a video for you here. I think they're going to switch my mic over. I'll give them a sec to do that. All right.
Liang Chow runs a dried seafood shop. It sells anything from under the sea, including what we're looking for. Manta gill plates cost $420 a kilogram here, 2.5 times more than in Sri Lanka, and similar to the price of mid-ranged shark fins. Liang Chow swears by their medicinal benefits.
嗱，呢啲彭魚腮咧，我哋自細咧細路哥出馬，咁啊當佢出完馬之後咧，就一定要買嚟食嘅。
用什麼方式來準備這種所謂的藥材？
咁咧呢啲可以清熱散毒，可以用佢煲粥煲水嚟飲，亦都可以咧用芫茜水煲佢，愛嚟抹身沖涼。
你怎麼知道分量用多少？
呢啲係民間嘅驗方嘅啫，差唔多嗱呢度咧咁一塊咁啊分2次啊3次咁咯，細路哥小朋友數十年來都係咁噶啦。咁啊大人咧，你有暗瘡啊之類咧，都可以清熱毒嘅。
這個有中醫的根據嗎？
中醫啦，好多樣嘢都係。 早上傳落嚟嘅驗方，你話有咩根據啦？咁我真係唔曉講噃。
So what I hope you picked up there in that video is that it cures measles, it cures acne. You can whatever that was about, rub yourself down with it in the shower, and that's just what this guy had to say. We've heard it cures respiratory issues, absolutely everything under the sun, and that's usually a pretty good indication that it doesn't really do much of anything. And an interesting thing that we found as well is that there are texts, there are traditional Chinese texts that prescribe a lot of these medicines, but manta gill plates aren't in any of those. So it's actually a recent invention in the last 10, 15 years as far as we can tell. And it is the primary driver for all of the targeted fisheries for mantas and also mobula rays. And the result are dried seafood stalls in China like this one, which this has probably hundreds, if not thousands, of manta and mobula rays represented here just by their gill rakers. So it's a huge, huge, huge problem. And over the last 10 years, this has been growing and growing. So this isn't the magnitude here, the number of landings is a huge underestimate. So this is just what's reported. The important thing is the trend. So it's growing and growing and growing. So this is what we're really worried about. We're also worried about bycatch. So mantas are very easily caught in purse seines, in gill nets, also even sometimes in trawls. And even historically, that's been a big threat for mantas and mobula rays. So we know that they're being caught. We know that the populations are most likely being impacted because of what we know about the demographics, how slow their reproductive rates are. There's absolutely no way you could sustainably harvest these guys. But we don't have a lot of evidence as to what's actually happening, how their populations are responding. So we can look at some of these recent studies which have identified declines in mantas and mobulas just based on divers seeing them in the water. So this is a global study. This is one that's a little more specific at the Cocos Island Marine Reserve, which was just recently published. And so we've got declines of mantas and maybe a little bit for mobulas. But this isn't, this is a really good indicator that manta populations are declining, but it's not hard numbers, right? And so that's where we're going to start getting into the research. So we know that they're in trouble. We know populations have to be declining. We've got some circumstantial evidence and some observations that suggest that's the case. But what we want to know is, well, is it some populations or is it every population in the world that's declining? How fast are they declining? Are there differences between these populations? We want to know what we can do to help prevent that. So what we need to know to answer those questions and to do something about this, I'm kind of echoing when I move around, is number one, what is a population of manta rays? And that's a surprisingly difficult thing to answer. And we're going to talk about how we're trying to answer that now. We need to know how much these populations are moving around, and we'll explain why that's important. We want to know how the fisheries are affecting individual populations, and then what sort of conservation and management action would actually be effective for preventing declines and protecting these populations. So when we talk about mantas and try and answer these questions, we need to think about them in the context of what habitat they live in and what other species are similar to them. So what do we know about? Well, we know about big, large pelagic animals that are also filter feeders like blue whales and other cetaceans, the rorqual whales. And we know that these guys are migrating from the poles and from high latitudes to warm equatorial waters every year. So they're making a round-trip journey that can be 7,000 kilometers one way, 15,000 kilometers round trip. Really, really amazing migrations. We've got things like leatherback sea turtles, which are going from Papua New Guinea all the way to the California current by us. So we wave hi to those leatherback sea turtles when they head back to Indonesia and West Papua. We've also got things like bluefin tuna. So this is a really classic example of not only how much animals move around, but also the management problems that we encounter when we have highly migratory species. So bluefin tuna, you guys are probably familiar with them because you've got some fisheries for them just here off Boston. These guys migrate across the Atlantic. They've been a real challenge to manage effectively, basically because in order to do anything, to get any management, you need every country that these guys pass through to agree, all right, well, we'll stop fishing them or we'll cut back on fishing. And that turns out to be a really, really hard thing to do. And so despite years of management by these international groups, these bluefin tuna populations continue to decline. Every year, scientists recommend a sustainable catch quota, and the actual catch quota is higher, and then the actual catch is even higher than that. So we're not doing a great job with these international management strategies. We can also look at species that are closely related to mantas, other large elasmobranchs that feed on similar things like whale sharks. These guys are moving really, really far, 7,000 kilometers all across the Atlantic. And some genetic work actually suggests that there might just be one population of whale sharks that lives all throughout the world's oceans, right? So they might be migrating constantly. We've even got data on really closely related species to mantas, like mobulas. And these guys are also making really long distance journeys. At least 3,000 kilometers have been reported, and they're probably moving quite a bit faster than that. All right, so what do mantas do? Well, we can look at their distribution, and these are hot spots where we see lots of mantas. And of course, we're interested in fisheries and how those are interacting with these populations. And one possibility could be that, well, they're just like whale sharks. They're moving all throughout here. This is the potential manta flight pattern. And so, maybe the guys that we see in Mexico just came from Mozambique. And that's going to be a challenge for management. But to some extent, it's going to give us a little more time to respond to these fisheries, because any fishery is drawing from a much bigger population, right? So while a fishery in Indonesia is going to impact mantas everywhere in the world, we've got a little bit of time to respond to it. Now, the alternative could be isolated subpopulations, where these mantas, every single population is its own population, there's no connectivity, and any population here that has a fishery is in deep trouble, right? So by definition, they have to be smaller populations. And once a big fishery in Indonesia or Sri Lanka wipes out its local population, there's nobody coming from Mexico or Mozambique to replace them. Could also be something in between with regional connectivity. And so to answer these questions and figure out what they're doing, not just on the short term, but also the long term, we're using a variety of different research methods that cover as much of a spatial scale and also a temporal or time scale as we can possibly manage. So So these are 3 complementary techniques that I'll talk about. There's satellite telemetry, which is tagging, stable isotope analyses, and I'll give you some information on those, and then genetics as well. And so these are telling us about the local movements every single day, how far are they traveling, the decadal connectivity, so on matters of decades and years, how much are they moving around, and then genetics tells us how much these populations are connected on much longer timescales. All right, that's boring, right? Let's look at some videos. So our 2 main study sites for the tagging are Indonesia and Mexico. And I'm going to show you a video. This is some of the tagging that we just did recently in Mexico, which was supported by MCAF, so thank you very much for making that happen. So these are the oceanic mantas. These guys are probably 4.5 to 5 meters across. Got a bunch of divers in the water with them. This is one of the most famous places on the planet to dive with these big oceanic mantas. And so here you'll see this is how easy it is to get a photo ID. They just, oh man, sorry. They just swim right over your head, make it really easy for us. So these photo ID databases are really easy and important data because you can, as a diver, you can collect the photo ID and send it to us, and that's really useful information. So these are the black morphs. They're really neat. They look like stealth bombers. And this is what we call chevron, the sort of typical coloration pattern. So this is the friendly behavior, right? They come right over your head. They play with you. They're looking for interactions. And these guys don't seem to mind too much when we tag them. So here we go. We're about to put out a tag. We use these archival tags. So mantas don't come up to the surface like air breathers like turtles or marine mammals. So we can't just have a tag that sends a satellite or a GPS location every time it comes up. Instead, we have to use these nifty little devices which collect information on depth, light level, and temperature. And we can actually use that to reconstruct their path and their movements after the tag pops off. So we put these out for 6 months, and I bite my nails the whole time and wait for them to pop off. And then this is just the best site, 1, 2, and you'll see a third manta in a second here who was also tagged. So if anybody's worried about, those poor mantas who are being tagged, that's great. I'm glad that you're feeling for them. But really, they hung out and played with us for a couple hours after that, so they don't seem too bothered. So what do we find? Not what we expected. So here we've got, to orient you, we've got Raja Ampat on the left. So this is Indonesia, that's West Papua, close to where all those leatherback turtles go to breed. And on the right, we've got Pacific Mexico, that's Baja coming down. And our 2 study sites in Mexico are the Reproduction Islands on the left there, out in the middle of the ocean, which is where you saw the video just now. And then Bahia de Banderas, or Puerto Vallarta, is the closest town on the mainland. And so in the 6 months across several years, 6 months for each tag, these guys didn't go very far. So in Indonesia, they didn't really leave the region. They never left Indonesian waters. That's really important, and we'll talk about why. And over here in Mexico, these guys didn't even move between 2 sites that were only 600 kilometers apart, right? So that's an easy swim for something that's 20 feet across. So this was really, really surprising to us. And what it's showing is that these guys aren't your typical large, highly migratory species. And that's probably going to be very useful when it comes to management. So we'll talk about that in a second, but first, all of you perceptive students of the world are probably thinking, well, okay, that's great, but that's 6 months, right? And these guys live for 40, 50, 60 years. How does this actually, is this representative of their actual long-term movements? So that's where the stable isotope analysis comes in. So we're using nitrogen and carbon isotopes, and a little bit of background to get you on the same page. So isotopes are conserved in biological systems. So whatever you're eating is going to be represented in your tissue. So we can go and take a tissue sample or a hair sample, and I can tell you if you've been eating more corn or Big Macs. And we can do the same for mantas. And there's variation around the world. And so that's really a good example of that is oxygen isotopes in the U.S. So if you're a manta ray that lives in Texas year-round and you're eating steak all the time, you're going to look a lot like Texas, that red value. And if you're a manta that lives up in the Northwest, you're going to have a very different isotope value. Now, if you're a recently retired manta and you're going on a road trip of the U.S. national parks, and you're hitting everyone, going all across the country, and you're stopping at road stops along the way, you're going to be an average of everywhere that you've gone and eaten, right? So the same is true for mantas in the water, not the vacationing type. So if they're swimming all around the world, they're all going to kind of be a scatter. They're going to be an average of everywhere they've gone. Whereas if they're staying in one place, they're going to represent the place that they live, and they're going to be different from somebody who lives somewhere else. So, all right, the suspense is building. What did we find? Well, we found pretty much the same thing that we found with the tags, which is that there are really big differences in the isotope signatures between regions. And based on how long the tissue turnover rate is, or basically what period of time a manta biopsy represents, we now know that these guys are staying put, or at least aren't mixing with other populations on multi-year timescales. And finally, we can do some fancy genetics. I won't bore you with the details. And we find the same thing. These populations are completely separate. Even the guys in Mexico that are only 600 kilometers apart. All right, really, really interesting. So that means there's no mixing, or very, very little mixing on generational timescales. So we're pretty sure that the reason they're not moving around is because they've got food around all year round. So why would you go anywhere? Why would you travel 7,000 kilometers if you've got food right there? And the majority of these big, highly migratory species, well, why are they migrating? They're moving between feeding grounds, like these baleen whales. They go between feeding grounds up near the poles to warmer waters where they pup or they calf down in equatorial waters. Same thing with leatherback sea turtles. They're going between these nesting beaches and very productive waters in the California current to feed. And so we're pretty sure that the reason we don't see mantas migrating is because they don't have to move between two critical habitats. They've got everything they need right there. So how can we use this information to have less of this and more of these happy mantas with divers? So the economics start coming into play here. So you look at these numbers and you know already that mantas are worth about $140 million in tourism every year. And we also know that mantas are worth about $5 million in fisheries. So why hasn't everybody on the planet who's fishing mantas now started saying, okay, well, how about I take you out snorkeling with these guys and you pay me 10 times as much? Well, one of the reasons is what we call the tragedy of the commons. So these bluefin tuna are another really good example. So nobody in the Mediterranean is going to stop fishing for bluefin tuna because they're just going to say, well, hey, you guys in Boston, you're not going to stop if I stop. So I'm just going to keep fishing them until they're gone because I'm going to get my money's worth and that's it. Well, it turns out that we actually avoid a lot of these problems when we have manta rays, oceanic mantas, because they're not doing that. So this has been really important in the conservation efforts. We can actually go to a country like Indonesia or Mexico or any other country with a manta population and say, hey, look, these are your mantas. They're not swimming up to the Philippines and getting caught after they leave your country's waters. So you actually have the capacity to make a huge amount of money off of manta tourism and probably not lose a lot by ending those fisheries, right? And so they can now justify spending lots of money to prevent fisheries, have some angry fishermen who just lost some of their livelihood, and also pay a lot to enforce these regulations and know that they're getting their money's worth. So this has been really important. Actually, just last year, Indonesia declared the entire country, which used to be one of the largest fisheries for manta rays, a manta sanctuary. So now there are no fisheries for mantas, no legal fisheries for mantas in Indonesia. And that was in part because of this information. We can show them, hey, you know, it's your resource. And they've actually been enforcing it pretty well, which was one of the major concerns. How about bycatch? How can we prevent bycatch, which we know is another major threat? Well, here we've got a marine protected area. This is out at the Revillagigedo Islands, where we saw that tagging video. And this has been declared a Mexican biosphere reserve. So there's no fishing, no commercial or recreational fishing allowed within 6 miles of each island. But we know that mantas are moving in between these islands, and they're also spending time around the islands, but they're not really going that far. And so there's actually a proposal up to get this protected area listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which would dramatically expand the extent of the spatial protection. And a big part of that is the mantas, right? So this is one of the only places in the world where you have these kind of manta encounters. So having this information about where they go, that they actually have relatively restricted home ranges is really, really important when it comes to this sort of management strategy. So I happen to be a big fan of local management. I've seen a lot of really great success stories. This is another place where I work, Cabo Pulmo in Mexico. So we went from about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a barren wasteland that had been completely fished out. And then these fishermen said, okay, this isn't working, so what can we do? Well, let's go for dive tourism. And they completely stopped fishing for 25 years. And now we have huge biomass recoveries, these incredible schools of jacks. We've got sharks coming back down on the bottom right there. And this is all driven by community support. And it's also driven by tourism value. And so that's why I think of this as sort of a model for what we can do with mantas, because mantas are hugely valuable in tourism, much more valuable than fisheries. And I think that this is the kind of model that we should be pursuing. We also see a lot of successes where you can go in and you can work with local people who have their own traditional management strategies and help them adapt those to modern pressures so that they can better respond to declining fisheries and so on. So the same thing, this has been a really big part of the Indonesia spatial protection, working with these local villages, helping get fishing rights and create these marine protected areas. So I think that's sort of where we should be moving in the future. And to do this, I'm just going to finish up with a couple of these initiatives that we have to engage these local communities, get them into these tourism and manta conservation modes. So the first is at our mainland study site in Mexico. So here we've got one of the biggest threats to mantas here is bycatch. So mantas are protected, you can't legally fish them, but they get caught up in discarded fishing nets and fishing line. They get struck by boats as well. And so what we're doing is we've got a training program with local students, and these guys come out and we teach them how to tag mantas, how to collect photo IDs and other environmental data, and they become ambassadors in the local community for manta conservation. And they're really the people who are best positioned to help change attitudes towards mantas and encourage sustainable tourism. And I think probably the most important thing that we do is we get them in the water with mantas. And now every one of these students who is an undergrad is pursuing a graduate degree with our program as well. I'll just finish up with some conclusions. Well, I hope that you've taken away from this that manta populations are very, very threatened, both by targeted fisheries and also incidental bycatch. What we've learned is that mantas don't fit that highly migratory paradigm. They're not moving around, they're not crossing ocean basins, they're actually staying put, and that makes them a lot easier to manage. And we should be pushing this national and local level management because that's probably the most effective and also the easiest to implement and enforce. And I think that we can get that done by engaging local communities, showing them the benefits of manta tourism, that mantas are more valuable alive than they are dead, and get them to be the new ambassadors for manta conservation. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all of our vast number of collaborators, and this isn't even the full extent, they didn't all fit on one slide. Lots of international work going on here, lots of really important people who are contributing to the local conservation and research, and also lots of different funders, including MCAF, so thank you guys very much for your support. And I'm just going to give all the credit for this wonderful presentation to Madeline, my girlfriend, because she helps me with all the design. I'm no good at that. So with that, thank all of you for your attention and for coming tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
If mantas are such homebodies, how did they get to be such a widely dispersed species?
Sure, great. That's a really great question. So, as is the case with a lot of these circumglobally distributed species, you're absolutely right. They had to go long distances at some point. And we do see range expansions. So we saw a manta in San Diego. It's the only time I've ever seen a video of a manta swimming in a kelp forest. And that was just this past winter. And so we had this big bulge of warm water that came up. It's sort of a, not quite an El Nino, but something weird going on. And it brought a manta with it. And it must have come from Baja. It's the closest population we know of. So there are events where these guys, they move around. We see them down in New Zealand and New Jersey very, very rarely. But that's how populations spread, right? You get one migrant who just happened to be the one that swam halfway around the world. Or two, yeah, you need two, that's right. You need a male and a female, so they have to get kind of lucky, actually. But we see this in other species also. So humpback whales, there was a really interesting paper published just a few years ago. You have the normal behavior where they're swimming from the poles to the equator or warmer waters closer to the equator. And you've got separate populations that are all sort of in their own little track. And then you had one humpback whale that swam from, I think it was Brazil, all the way around Africa up into the Indian Ocean. So that sort of thing happens. It's rare, but that's how these populations probably have spread historically. Yeah. So the question was, where did this manta gill plate trade come from if it's not an ancient historical text? Or historical remedy. So we have some indications from some of the people who work in the markets where these gill plates come from. I don't have a really good answer for you, but what we think happened is as sharks declined from the global shark fin trade, a lot of these people were catching mantas by accident in the same ports where they were, putting thousands and thousands of shark fins into the market. And we think what may have happened is that somebody realized, okay, we think we can maybe get some money from these mantas if you go start catching them. Because they all came through the same middlemen from the same ports. We think it might have been a response to declining incomes from shark fisheries in a lot of these regions. So I can't say that for sure, but that's sort of what we think at the moment. Great question. So the question was, we know that mantas are really intelligent. We have a lot of indications to suggest that. And do we see that reflected in how they care for their offspring? No, absolutely not. I see that reflected in how they interact with humans, but there's, as far as we know, absolutely no parental care of the offspring. They come out, they're completely self-sufficient, and off they go to live their lives. We think there's a lot of habitat segregation as well. The young actually go into different habitats because we don't usually see them ever. So good question. Interesting. Okay, so the question was about manta rays in captivity. And I think the gist of it was, they're these big animals. A lot of people have problems with large marine megafauna in captivity. And do I personally think whether it's a good thing, and if they're sort of a good opportunity to help raise awareness about mantas. I'm not going to touch the whole controversy thing. I think that raising awareness is a really important thing, definitely. And I think there are so many opportunities to get in the water with mantas. They're pretty accessible at these hotspots. I personally love seeing animals out in the wild, but sure, the aquariums have a huge education component. So I'll leave you with that vague answer. So the question was those numbers that I threw out, the $140 million a year in tourism and the $5 million in fisheries. What does that reflect? Is it a population, the whole thing? That's the entire global tourism trade for mantas, and that is definitely an underestimate. It was really conservative, didn't take into effect, okay, well, you show up and you book a hotel or, et cetera, et cetera. And the fisheries value, it's really hard to know. There are so many different sources for the fisheries. That was an estimate. I think, the relative differences between the two probably holds up, but the absolute values might be off.
Sure. Is that the same, if you were to break it down by the individual populations, would that still remain approximately the same for each individual population? Or are there some where the pressure would be much greater for fishing?
Yeah, so the question was about the different populations. Are both the values in fisheries and in tourism, are they different? And absolutely. So, places where you've got long established tourism industries around mantas, much, much, much more valuable. And places like Indonesia and Sri Lanka where you have fisheries, the fisheries are going to be much generally more valuable. But I think either way, the tourism potential is always going to be higher than the fisheries. Mm-hmm. The question was about, are there any consumer side efforts to help prevent this gill plate trade and so on? Yes, there are. So actually, one of the big conservation successes for mantas was that they were listed on CITES, the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species. And so that means that legally, no country can import or export any manta product unless the origin has shown scientifically that that fishery is sustainable, which is basically impossible. So that's great, and it was a huge first step. Mobulas weren't listed. There are some problems with being able to identify the two. I mean, we can identify them. We have ID guides. But actually getting inspectors to be able to tell the difference is, steps in the future that we need to take. And then you're always going to have illegal trade, same way you do with ivory and rhino horn and so on. It just depends how much people are willing to pay. Great. Yeah, so the question was, ecotourism can get out of hand, and are there any measures that have been taken to help make sure that the ecotourism itself remains sustainable and doesn't impact the populations? And yes, definitely. So at the Manta Trust, we have a code of conduct that we've come up with with all the best knowledge, both from researchers and tourism operators and so on, and we're trying to distribute that widely so that people take note. A lot of it comes down to local regulation. So the Maldives was a really good example. There were at that site with all the crazy feeding. There were dozens of boats, hundreds of divers and snorkelers in the water. It was becoming a problem. They were actually interacting a little too much with the mantas. And the result was that the government, after the site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the government clamped down, no more diving. They have a warden there. The number of snorkelers in the water is closely regulated. So you do need a little bit of local management to help make that possible. But yeah, we definitely try and educate operators and so on.
Please join me again in thanking Josh for this great presentation.
The traditional way of going about wildlife conservation is very hands-off. And the United States, to its great credit, pioneered the whole concept of wildlife refuges for the sake of conservation.